2,000 years ago, everyday Romans lived in tiny apartments in chaotic, overcrowded cities. Sound familiar? But despite the limited space, they come up with clever design solutions that still apply today. In fact, their apartments were compact, efficient, and surprisingly livable. So, how did they get it right 2 millennia ago, and why are we still struggling today? Let me take you inside one of the oldest apartment buildings in Rome to show you what they knew that we've somehow forgotten. Maybe the past holds the answers that we've been looking for. What do you think? Let's dive in. Hello, I'm Lorenzo, an Italian architect based in London. I was born and raised in Rome, and I also studied my undergraduate degree in architecture in Rome. Growing up in this city, like most tourists, I was captivated by the grandeur of Rome. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, the triumphal arches. But over time, I started thinking, what about the average Roman people who didn't live like emperors? What were their homes like? For sure, they didn't live in luxurious palaces. In fact, they lived in tiny apartments stacked on top of each other. And yet, they made it work. Sometimes even better than what we do today. Today, I'm taking you inside a Roman insula, the ancient Roman version of a modern apartment building, to show you the design choices that made their apartments livable and how we can learn from them. To really understand how the ancient Romans used to live, it's important to mention the three main types of housing. These were luxurious single-family homes reserved for the wealthy patricians. You'd usually find them in residential neighborhoods, often with inner courtyards, private gardens, and elaborate decorations. They typically had 1 or 2 floors, and they were designed around the idea of privacy and prestige. These were large rural estates owned by the wealthy Romans, used either as a vacation home or as an agricultural center. They were expansive, often featuring gardens, courtyards, gyms, and porticos. If the villa was near the city, it was called a villa urbana. If it was in the countryside, it was a villa rustica. In both cases, these were symbols of wealth and escape from city life. This is where everyone else lived, the middle and lower classes. Insulae were multi-story buildings with compact apartments, stacked one above the other. They were a practical response to urban overcrowding, allowing large numbers of people to live close to the city center. It's estimated that under the rule of Septimius Severus, which is roughly the 3rd century AD, Rome had roughly 46,000 insula and only 8,000 domus. Right here is the Insula dell'Ara, one of the best preserved examples in the world. But don't let these ruins fool you. 2,000 years ago, this was a packed and chaotic apartment block, home to regular working-class Romans, also known as plebeians. Here's something you might not expect. These buildings were not owned by the people that lived in them. They were rented out by wealthy landlords. Think of them as the Roman equivalent of today's real estate investors. If you ever struggled renting a tiny apartment in New York, London, or Sydney, you're not alone. Because 2 millennia ago, Romans were dealing with the same thing. You know the story already. The rich owned the building, the less wealthy paid the rent. Nothing has really changed. Except back then, there was no tenant protection, no repairs, and no refund if your building collapsed. So at least we made a little progress. The Insula dell'Ara, dating back to the 2nd century AD, originally rose up to 5 stories and was constructed primarily in brick-faced concrete. It featured small stacked living units arranged vertically around the internal staircases. These apartments housed ordinary Roman citizens, for example craftsmen, merchants, and laborers. The ground floor included botteghe, or commercial spaces, functioning much like modern retail units. The 1st and 2nd floors were typically occupied by more affluent tenants, as they were more spacious and easier to access. In contrast, the upper floors, accessible only by narrow staircases and with lower ceilings and less light, were rented to poorer plebeians. This early example of mixed-use, high-density housing demonstrates a remarkably sophisticated approach to urban living, anticipating many principles of modern apartment design. Up next, the Roman design solutions that were ahead of their time. Ancient Romans didn't just cram people into tiny buildings. They took smart design choices that made these spaces quite livable, and we're now only starting to appreciate them again. But here's where things get really interesting, because the way Romans use space is the opposite of what we do today. Today, the most expensive homes in cities like New York and London are at the top. Luxurious penthouses with the best views. But in ancient Rome, it was the opposite. The top floors of the Insula were the cheapest because there was no running water. In fact, tenants had to hold water up multiple flights of stairs. There was a risk of fire as the buildings were made of wood and brick, and fires were quite common at the time. The absence of proper staircases was another issue. These were substituted by timber ladders. If you lived at the top, you were in the worst housing in the city, cramped, dark, and dangerous. Meanwhile, the wealthiest renters had apartments at the lower levels, close to shops, air, and actual running water. Quite interesting, right? Now take a look at these window openings. They may seem small, but they were essential for bringing light and ventilation, because unlike modern buildings, these apartments didn't have electricity or mechanical air circulation. The Romans also designed internal courtyards, which let fresh air flow through the apartments, similar to how we now use open-plan layouts, large windows, and skylights to make small spaces feel bigger. The residents of this insula used public latrines and bathhouses like the rest of the Romans. This sounds shocking today, but think about it. In modern cities, we're seeing a rise in co-living spaces, communal working areas, and shared laundries, because space is expensive. It turns out the Romans knew this already 2,000 years ago. So, how did the Romans get it right 2 millennia ago? They mastered 3 things: vertical living, shared spaces, and light. Yet, today, we'll still struggle with apartments that feel cramped and inefficient. So, what do you think? Have we actually progressed small space design, or have the Romans figured it out first? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this video fascinating, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. See you next week. Ciao!